Last week, you had names like Drake London, Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed, Cole Kmet, and Ken Walker bust in fantasy football, and they cost you a win that week. Now, in today's video, I'm bringing you 5 players that could do the same in week number 9. 5 guys that I got bubble guts thinking about putting into my roster. For most of you, you might have better options. The first name that I am terrified to start, regardless of if ETN plays or not, is Tank Bigsby at the Philadelphia Eagles. Again, if ETN plays, this take is even more magnified. I don't want to start Bigsby, but even if ETN doesn't play, I'm not sure Bigsby's a good play this week. First off, Philadelphia is the 7th worst matchup for running backs when you adjust for schedule. And specifically, if we look at the last 4 weeks, the Eagles' rush defense has really tightened up, guys. In that span, the last 4 weeks, they are 2nd in fewest points allowed to the running back position. In the last 4 weeks, they're averaging about 9.59 points per game to the entire running back room of opposing offenses. They've really figured it out. That defensive line is extremely talented. I think they're starting to put the pieces together. And on the year, we have seen running backs have decent days against the Eagles, but they've normally been bailed out by something. What do I mean by that? Well, Alvin Kamara had 15.7 fantasy points, but all of his action came through the air, right? 3.3 yards per carry is not a very high number. Tyrone Tracy had 3.8 yards per carry. And then Chase Brown averaged 2.6 yards per carry, just 32 rush yards, and he was bailed out by a touchdown. If he didn't have that touchdown, which is very hard to predict on a week-to-week basis, he would have somewhere in the range of, what, around 6 fantasy points. So it's just a lot of people have been bailed out. Bigsby is not the pass catching guy for this team, and that concerns me. And if you look at the Eagles defense in 2024, they're top 8 in fewest rushing yards allowed, fewest total yards allowed, and total points given up per game. They have really flipped the switch in the last four weeks or so. And the Jags are tied for the 2nd lowest implied team point total on the week, just 19 points, which isn't promising for Bigsby, especially considering game script. If they are down and they need to throw the ball, it's going to be ETN if he's healthy, or maybe even Dearness Johnson in the passing attack. So it's just really concerning for me. 7.5-point dogs the Jags are on, in this matchup. So there's a lot of names I'd rather start. If Tyrone Tracy is healthy and playing versus the Commanders, I'd rather play him. I'd rather play Ramondre Stevenson versus the Titans. I'd rather play Chase Brown versus the Raiders, or Rashad White or Bucky Irving versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and Alexander Madison versus the Bengals. So if you have some other options that you can put into your lineup, I would definitely look that way. All right, the second name that I'm concerned about this week, and I hate to say it, but I'm a bit concerned about Tua Tagovailoa this week. Tua Tags. It's so good to have him back. It's so good for this offense. I think Tyreek is safe. I do think names like Achane are going to be fine, and Waddle could have a good game. But the reality is Buffalo is the 5th worst matchup for your quarterback when adjusting for schedule. And the Bills defense this year, Tua, who played, I think, 75% of that game this year against them, had 8.5 points. CJ Stroud had 16.9 points. And then Geno Smith finished with 9 points last week. He didn't throw a touchdown. If you look at Tua specifically versus the Bills in the past 3 seasons, check this out. These are his point totals in games in the last 3 years. 8.5 points, 9.6 points, 14.9 points, 18.1 points, which is really the only good game in the past 3 years, and then again, 11.4 points. So more times than not, in the past 3 years, you would have regretted starting Tua against this defense. For whatever reason, it's kind of mental warfare right now. Buffalo has his number, and I'm hoping that that's not the case this week, because I'm going to be playing a lot of Dolphins everywhere, but it's hard to ignore history, and I think some people might have better options. For example, I'd rather play Joe Flacco at the Minnesota Vikings. That's a very good matchup for Joe Flacco. Matthew Stafford at the Seahawks. That could be a high-scoring game. Jared Goff at Green Bay. That could be a high-scoring game as well. Jordan Love plays Patrick Mahomes versus the Bucks. One of the best matchups for quarterbacks. That might seem obvious to people, but we haven't been wanting to play Patrick Mahomes most weeks this year. Bo Nix at the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens are a great matchup. Bo Nix is coming off a career-high game, had over 35 fantasy points. Sam Darnold versus the Colts on the opposite side of that Sunday Night Football game. So look, you can totally play Tua. Lower your expectations. It just concerns me. The third player that I do not want to play under any circumstance, I don't care how deep your format is. Well, okay, I do. If it's 16 team, of course, we'll change narrative here. But Diontae Johnson, I just don't see a scenario where he touches any of my lineups this week. I really don't. I struggle to think of a single lineup he would touch. Denver is the second worst matchup for your wide receiver. And we haven't been starting many wide receiver versus Denver. And it's just because they keep shutting them down. All right, check this out. The Broncos held DK Metcalf to 5.9 points, 29 yards. Pickens to 29 yards, 4.9 points. Evans to 17 yards and 3.7 points. And Garrett Wilson to 41 yards, 7 fantasy points. It's hilarious because last week I actually had Diontae Johnson on this video as well. And I didn't know he was going to be ruled out when I made the video. Last week he was slated to start against the Broncos as well. So it's funny how it's come back around. But the Broncos defense this year is top 4 in fewest passing yards, total yards, and points allowed per game. The Ravens, guys, are 9.5-point favorites, which means they probably won't have to throw the ball much in the second half. And that's a bottom 12 team in passing attempts per game that he's now joining. And wide receivers, even Zay Flowers is only a good start in neutral game scripts. Again, 9.5-point favorites. And there are reports recently that suggest Diontae Johnson might be the wide receiver 3 on this team. Justina Anderson reported this. I don't personally agree. I don't see why they would trade him to put him behind Bateman, but there's just enough red flags just to say, no, I'm not going to do it. All right. I'd rather start Shakir versus Miami, DeAndre Hopkins versus the Bucks, Amari Cooper versus Miami, Keenan Allen versus the Cardinals, JSN versus the Los Angeles Rams, and Jacoby Myers versus the Cincinnati Bengals. All right. The fourth player that I just don't want to start this week, if you have a better name, is J.K. Dobbins at the Cleveland Browns. The Browns are the third worst matchup for your running back when you adjust for schedule. Guys, we had Brian Robinson, who had 2.5 yards per carry versus this team, 18 rushing yards, but he got bailed out by 2 touchdowns. Think about that for a second. 2 touchdowns. That's 12 points. He finished with 13.8 points. Outside of the touchdowns, he had 1.8 fantasy points, okay? Saquon Barkley had his worst day as an Eagle, 2.6 yards per clip, 47 rushing yards, under 8 fantasy points. Chase Brown was held to 2.9 yards per carry against this team, which was absolutely rough. And here's the thing. We have seen J.K. Dobbins be really good in good matchups and has struggled in the more difficult ones. For example, the first 2 weeks of the season, he had the Raiders and the Panthers, 2 smash matchups. He did absolutely incredibly. Now, the next 2 games were tough matchups, right? The Pittsburgh Steelers and the Kansas City Chiefs. And in both of those games, averaging under 3 yards per clip and had under 10 fantasy points. Then there's this weird lull in Denver and Arizona, and another great game versus the Saints. Great matchup for your running backs. We actually told you to start him last week in our Dominate series, our Nuclear series. But the reality is, we have seen in bad matchups, he hasn't pulled through for your team. And with Jameis playing quarterback for the Cleveland Browns, they are able to move the ball. The offense looks better, which means we might see less garbage time carries for a name like J.K. Dobbins. If you have the following running backs, I'd rather play them this week. So, for example, guys like Tyrone Tracy versus the Commanders, again, if he is healthy. Chase Brown versus the Raiders, Rachaad White or Bucky Irving versus the Chiefs. I like both of those names better. Brian Robinson versus the Giants, or Chuba Hubbard versus the Saints. All right. Last name that we'll talk about today, and I don't imagine this one is met with a lot of rational comments down below, but I don't want to start Keon Coleman at the Miami Dolphins. And let me explain, because Keon Coleman's been on a heater. He's been very good, but I am a little bit concerned about this matchup. Number one, the Dolphins are the 5th worst matchup when you adjust for schedule for fantasy wide receivers. And if you look at specifically wide receivers who play the outside alignment, out wide receivers, right? They give up the 7th fewest points per game. But this is less about the matchup, and it's more about the fact that just team identity-wise, I don't believe we have seen it fully figured out just yet. There are going to be a lot of mouths to feed on a week-to-week basis. There have been 2 games since Amari Cooper was traded to the Buffalo Bills. The first game was versus Tennessee. Amari Cooper played like 35% of the snaps. He had 5 targets. Keon and Shakir both had 7. Okay, you expect Amari Cooper to play more snaps, right? Well, in the second game, he only gets 2 targets, while Shakir and Keon both over 7. Keon had 7, Shakir had 10. The reality is, I just don't see a scenario in which Amari Cooper is that uninvolved on a week-to-week basis. I just don't see that happening. Amari hasn't even played over 60% of the snaps since this team traded for him. I don't believe that's the game plan, and I just don't think we know exactly what this offense is going to look like yet moving forward. Add on to the fact that the Bills are 6.5-point favorites. Will they really need to throw that ball in the second half? I don't know. I think the Dolphins can keep up, but Vegas doesn't think so. And that's another reason to be a little bit more concerned. This team we know loves to run the ball. Could we be in the fourth quarter and it's James Cook, it's Ray Davis season? I'm too concerned. And I get it. If he's your best option, you have to play him. But here's some other names I'd like to play instead. Cortland Sutton versus the Ravens, best matchup for your wide receiver in fantasy football. Jacoby Myers versus the Bengals. Cedric Tillman, who's on a heater as well, versus the Chargers. Less mouths to feed, in my opinion. Josh Downs and Michael Pittman versus the Vikings. Those are two incredible starts. The Vikings are a great play, and this should be a high-scoring game. So look, those are 5 names that I personally prefer not to play. Of course, I think it goes without saying, but I always have to say it. I can't predict the future. Ultimately, of course, there's going to be a player on this list that does well, that goes off, that makes me look like a fool. But there's enough rationale and reasons behind my takes that I'd rather look for alternative names. Now, if you don't have alternative names, of course, you're going to have to start your best available players. Now, if you enjoyed the video, do me a favor, hit that like button to show some love. Subscribe if you like the content. Last thing I'll say is if you don't have a free account on Flock Fantasy yet, I can't encourage you more to go get one. Again, completely free when you use a promo code LAND, right? You got to use a promo code LAND at sign up. And when you do, LAND, you'll get access to the My Team feature, the expert consensus rankings, the trade calculator, all for free as a thank you for using our promo code LAND, LAND, at sign up, flockfantasy.com/LAND. And if you want to ask me a question, maybe you have a player in today's video and you don't know if you have a better option, check out the pinned comment. You can ask me a question through our website. I appreciate y'all for watching. Let's make some good decisions here in week 9 and get those wins as we get closer to the playoffs. All up. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.